We then began using that modified program, and we published a study in 1991 to show, hey, we're getting really strong results, 3 to 5 grade levels gain in children who are significantly severely dyslexic. Then we published 3 5-year randomized controlled trials in 1997, 98, 99, 2001, showing that when this program is systematically provided with high fidelity, it closes the gap for kids who are severely impaired. It prevents reading problems for kids who are at risk. It actually enriches those for kids who are not at risk. And we even show data showing that we can actually rebuild reading skills after brain damage for a reading deficit that's about 1,000 times more complicated than dyslexia, called phonological alexia. Good afternoon, Stephen. How are you this fine Friday?
Doing well. It's
right.
Fall's in the air. The weather's changing.
Yeah.
Here in Texas, we're not so close to the sun anymore, so we can actually go outside. So it's nice.
Well, and I happen to be in Missouri today, and yeah, we got fall colors here, beautiful temperatures, beautiful weather, and it's a fine day to talk about research. So the topic you and I are going to kind of delve into, and you're going to help me keep this at a more, parent-friendly level of discussion, because I've been doing research for decades and you get caught up in the jargon. So this is why it's always great to bounce stuff back and forth between the two of us, so we can kind of cover the professional knowledge base and also cover the parent knowledge base. But let's talk about the research that was happening from early on at a clinic called the Morris Center, which then later we created the Now Programs company, and we then branded programs. And I'll explain a little bit about why we did it the way we did it and what's the differences in a model when you kind of follow the medical model of creating products for market, like medications, versus other models that are different than that. So I think it'll be a great way to kind of have this conversation with our listeners and explain how much research did we really do before we even made this program commercially available? Because most people tell me over and again, they didn't realize how much work we had done. And I think that's probably an early segue to say you had the same experience. You saw some of our posts in Facebook talking about some of our data, some of our outcomes. Most people say, and you likewise, sounds too good to be true, or your phrase is a little bit stronger, and I'll let you repeat that one.
I told you were selling snake oil.
That's right. And I completely understood your perspective. I understood where you're coming from. It's not offensive to me at all, but it's like, okay, let's talk about that. Why do we say the things we say about the Now programs, and what data do we have that backs us up?
Well, really, from my perspective, especially at that point in time, I don't know who the Now company was. All I saw was, really long posts. and I mean, to kind of level set this from, speaking from the parents' perspective of diving in this and drinking from the fire hose, we always talk about dyslexia as being a long road. And you have people at all points along this road, some that are beginning, some of them that are got their feet wet and trying to figure out what's going on. And then those of us that are on the far other side of this road, the more seasoned parent, if you want to call it that. And, we get all of this stuff thrown at us constantly. We have, the school districts talking to us at a higher level than what we understand, or we're even trying to understand at that point, because we're trying to take it all in and make sense of, hey, my baby can't read. What do you mean my baby can't read? And he's got a disability, or she's got a disability, and they'll always struggle, and this, that, and the other. And then they keep throwing these, as my dad would call them, these 50-cent words, or dollar words. And we have no idea what they're talking about. And then they say, well, we have research behind it. We have evidence-based research, and we have this type of research, and we have some pilot study. We didn't know. We as parents don't know what to believe.
Yeah, that's a good point. And first I'm going to put up a slide that kind of shows like what is the problem, how big is this problem, and is it more than just dyslexia? But before I do that, I'm going to post out a link. This link takes it to a high level talk. If people really want to see this in a different format that we're going to talk about today, this is a talk geared towards professionals. In fact, it's a talk where I'm talking to 300 pediatric faculty at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And I'm explaining to these 300 professionals, PhDs, MDs, the research we did and how we actually also used it to build the nation's first free charter school for dyslexia. And so that link is going up now across the platform so people can look at that later as well. But let's first pull up the issue of how big is the literacy crisis in the US? And when we look at this first slide, we see that, this is measuring the level of proficient reading skills at different grade levels, grades 4, grades 8, and grades 12, on average across every state in the US. And you see the numbers 35, 34, 37 circled in red. That means on average, fourth graders across the United States, every state of the United States, on average, only 35% of them are proficient readers. That means grade level accuracy, grade level fluency, grade level comprehension. Eighth graders, it's 34%. Grade level accuracy, fluency, comprehension, defined as proficient reading skills. And 12th graders, it's 37%. This is not dyslexia. This is the average proficiency of reading skills across the nation, across every state in the United States. And you might ask, well, okay, well, when was this data taken? Well, let's look at the next slide. It shows you here is data that's been taken from 1992 until 2017. And we actually have data from 1971 to 2022. And it doesn't look any different than this data. This data from 92 to 2017 shows those fourth graders, eighth graders, and 12th graders literacy rates of proficient reading skills across those decades. And you see it's just a flat line. And it means our literacy instruction in the United States, when it's allowed to be just randomly thrown at kids and every teacher does whatever she or he thinks might be effective, is not effective. It's harming children who don't have dyslexia and are not learning to read. And so we've got this big problem where we've got a field that's not been pushed to become what we call evidence-based. What we mean by that in the medical arena is physicians cannot give patients a medicine that they made up in their back office. That's called medical malpractice. A medication like penicillin has to be tested scientifically compared to other medications to be proven to be safe, to be effective, and to do consistently what it actually says it's going to do. That's how penicillin became the #1 antibiotic for strep throat. They did something called randomized controlled trials, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But now that we know the problem is really bigger than dyslexia, then let's look at what happens when you try to tease a problem apart. You try to understand what might be happening for dyslexia, and we look at a theoretical paper. And this is
let's stop real quick. Let's go back to that graph.
Appreciate that.
So, for our listeners and viewers, you can look at this graph a couple different ways. Either A, this is just normal. Only 38 or 34% of our kids are ever going to learn to read. Just that's what it is. Which I don't believe that, but we'll say that. The other is obviously there's a problem. I affectionately call it kick the can education, where you start in kindergarten and you're struggling to read and the teacher just doesn't have enough time to from their perspective to really do some one-on-one teaching with you. So they kick the can to the next grade. You get into first grade. Well, the teacher in first grade believes that kindergarten should have already learned to read. In kindergarten, I don't have time to teach you to read. We're just going to kick the can to second grade. And then you get to fifth grade and, or third grade and the wheels fall off.
Yeah.
Or we can look at it like you and I and many others in this field look at it, which is there's a systemic problem, not only in the way that we're teaching gen ed kids to read,
Mm-hmm.
because that number that baseline should be well above the 35, 38%.
Yeah.
So at best, what we've found is, there's lots of studies that say it's between, depending on which part of the world you're in, between 10 and 20% of the population having dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it as high as 30% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And we know in prison it's 50% of the population.
Right. At least.
And that 50% number was taken back in 99.
Right.
So we all know that education in prison hasn't gotten any better. So that number has probably skyrocketed also.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying all this, and I want to take the time to say this because I want parents to be able to understand when a graph like this or chart like this gets put up, how to actually look at this and decipher what are they actually trying to tell us and what are they showing us without telling us.
Right. Nope, makes sense 100%. And so now that we know that there's a larger problem than just dyslexia intervention, it's actually just our literacy instructional programs. We're not giving teachers programs that have been actually tested and proven to be highly effective. The parallel is if we did not give physicians antibiotics, a lot of kids would die from strep throat because the physicians did not have the tested and proven program treatment antibiotic. The same thing is what's been happening in education. We've been so focused on just letting every teacher kind of figure it out on your own. That's like making every kid a guinea pig because some teachers figure it out better than others. And some people are like, well, the teachers just need more background knowledge. Well, that doesn't fly if you parallel it back to pediatricians. Pediatricians know a lot about the body. They know a lot about chemicals, but they still would not be able to randomly mix a few chemicals and make penicillin. That takes an extensive amount of science, research, and high caliber research. And it comes from a theory as well. So the next slide really talks about there's some theoretical models about how dyslexia may be related to some of the sensory motor systems that precede phonological awareness, which means how well does your visual system and your auditory system and your oral touch system and oral movement system begin to wire together to build 4 ways to distinguish the sounds of words, what's alike about them, what's different about them, and begin to differentiate them and know the number of sounds, the order of sounds, what's first, second, third. So this is a world famous behavioral neurologist who just passed away recently, Dr. Ken Heilman, a developmental behavioral pediatrician, Dr. Ann Alexander, and a pediatric neurologist, Key Javeller, put their mixture of adult and pediatric backgrounds together. And they wrote this developmental paper about the theory behind what we think might be contributing to weaker phonological processing, given its genetic links, and contributing to difficulties in kids with dyslexia from building phonological awareness and building their ability to sound out words to read. And we need to have a theoretical model first of where to start. And then you begin to kind of test that theory. Questions, thoughts about that one, Stephen?
So what I also want to make sure that our listeners are picking up here is when we're going to walk through this, we're really walking through how do you get to the point of really researching a problem? Right. So in the beginning, we saw the test score data. We had data that says nothing's changing. We're doing things 1,001 different ways over that last 30 years. Nothing changed. So we have to do. We found the problem. Now we're looking at, basically the data that is going to support going in and figuring out what type of study should we be looking at and how should we put this together.
Right. So then we look at the different types of research. So with the next slide, we also then try to test out some of this data too. And this is actually a study that I did as part of my dissertation. We began looking at brain function, fMRI. And here I'm looking at adults and trying to understand where the cortex is working or not working when you're doing these auditory, phonological working memory tasks. We really felt like that was one of the key elements of what's happening that makes it harder for kids to get sounds and letters matched together and begin to build this really critical reading skill called decoding, which means can you say the first sound, say the second sound, say the third sound, and blend them together accurately and not make one of those 5 phonological mistakes. Typically, children or adults and teens with dyslexia will add a sound and not know it. They'll omit a sound and not know it. They'll reverse 2 sounds and they didn't know they reversed them. They'll repeat a sound or they'll substitute one sound in place of another. Those are the 5 phonological mistakes they can make, or they'll completely just guess at the word, trying to memorize as many words as possible. So we were trying to theoretically understand what was going on, and that led me to join a group in Gainesville, Florida called the Morris Center. And so the next slide shows how we began to look for what could we do about this. And this was what we call a pilot study. We had about 10 to 12 kids who came through the clinic. We measured their progress and looked to see, how much progress did we make when we used this program written by the Lindenmoods back in 1969 called Auditory Discrimination in Depth. It was a theory driven from developmental speech language pathologist Patricia Conway Lindenmood, which many people understand. And that's my late aunt and my late uncle. And they began to tease apart where they think the developmental process was breaking down for kids not building that phonological awareness. And the Morris Center is a developmental behavioral clinic with a transdisciplinary team. So it's speech pathology is your language specialist. OT is your visual processing, sensory motor, visual plus motor, your energy level regulation, kind of part mood regulation as well. That's their specialty. And then psychology is the behavior, anxiety, depression, mood. Their specialty is there as well. And we're bringing them all together. But at that time, too, the Morris Center Clinic also had a developmental behavioral pediatrician and a PhD aphasiologist, which is a speech pathologist who studies language problems after a brain injury called stroke. And I worked with them and I joined them in 1989, and we started modifying that ADD program. And we began testing it out on some kids in the clinic because it was just good clinical judgment. We were doing the best we could figure out. And then we published a paper on it to say, hey, here's some kids and here's their data. And I'll come back to the data later on. Right now, I just want people to understand this course of research we're doing started back in 1991, building on something that had been started back in the 1960s by the speech therapist, linguist team of Patricia and Charles Lindenmood. So the next slide shows that, okay, but this is just kind of a small case study, pilot study. It really won't prove anything. It doesn't prove we could get the results again later on. It just says, hey, and I'll, give the punchline already. It showed that we made about 3 to 5 grade levels gain in reading skills in about a few weeks of instruction, like about 9 weeks of instruction. But it doesn't mean we could do it again with any other kids. It just means those kids, that's what happened. So when you really want to do a research study that gives you confidence and assurance that the method of the program, all 10 steps, all 20 steps of what you do, if you do it with another child, like the children who are in the study, you can expect the same results. There's only one caliber of research that gives you that assurance, and it's called a randomized controlled trial. Now, if you go to the Yale Center for Creativity and Dyslexia website and look up evidence-based, this is the only caliber of research that Dr. Sally Shaywitz advocates for, that every dyslexia program should be tested by randomized controlled trials. That's how science proved penicillin is best for strep throat, and it's how it proved it is not best for ear infections, is they compared penicillin to other antibiotics in randomized controlled trials and found which one was most effective for what. And then from the randomized controlled trial, you get those 5 elements that are listed on the screen. It's the highest scientific rigor, which means the outcomes are pretty much going to be due to what you did in the study. It gives you the highest reliability of results. It means you can expect that the results you got in this study will be the same results you get with any kids like the kids in the study anywhere in the world, because you've done this randomized controlled trial. It also gives you a degree of assurance and causality that it was your treatment program that caused the outcomes. And for parents, it gives you better decision making. Where do you spend your money? Do I spend the money on this program that's been popular, has been around for 70 years, and lots of people talk about it? But there's also a bunch of people off to the side who say, yeah, I tried that, didn't work for me. Everyone says it works, but it didn't work for my kid. And you're then kind of taking a guess. You're just randomly hoping this might be the right place to spend the money. but there's no really scientific rigor or reliability or causality that gives you the best assurance that what you're choosing has the best chance of making strong outcomes. And that leads to the fifth thing. You then can trust the reliability, you can trust that you're more likely to get the same outcomes, and it's going to be safe and effective for your child. So when you do randomized controlled trials, in our case, we took that pilot study data, we submitted a 500 to 600 page research study design to a big government body called the National Institutes of Health, Child Health and Human Development. And they're a panel of national experts in reading, review your study and rank them. Only typically studies in about the top 3% actually get funded. And the Morris Center partnered with Florida State University, and we didn't do one randomized controlled trial. We did 3 5-year randomized controlled trials to try to make sure that what we were doing gave us the best chance to make the most growth most consistently in 2 ways. So the next slide shows an early publication study was we showed that we were trying to prevent the reading difficulties for kids who are high risk for dyslexia. And we gave an early release of the data back in 1997. The next slide shows that we gave the final version of this data in 1999. I think that's right. I can't see the numbers on this one. No, sorry, that one's 2001. We did the final paper in 2001 on the preventing of dyslexia. The next slide is another randomized controlled trial. This was not preventing it. This is remediating it. We did another 5-year study, randomized controlled trial, to say, can you take 8 to 10-year-olds who are severely dyslexic, which means their reading and decoding skills are around the bottom 5th percentile. That means 95% of their same age classmates are better at sounding out words and reading than they are. And can you change that outcome? And not only did we measure, could you change the outcome, we also measured, but what happens 1 year after you stop the instruction, you stop the training? What happens 2 years after you stop the training? Because if you really change the skills, they should keep growing and building over time. And then our third randomized controlled trial, this is the next slide, this was looking at a different question. Okay, we already proved that we could change those decoding skills, and I'll show you the slides with the data outcomes next. So I'm going to kind of give you the big picture of how we did all these studies first. We then did another 5-year randomized controlled trial to find out, after you change 8 to 10-year-olds reading accuracy, what's the best way to change their reading fluency? And you might be surprised by the outcomes. So Stephen, give me your thoughts on that so far. It's a bunch of science data. And for some families or some parents or even some professionals, that might be more than they can really wrap their head around. But basically, it's 3 5-year studies. It's 15 years of my life. And I'm the person in all of those studies who is responsible for training the teachers and the instructors, because some of them weren't educators and some of them were, who delivered the treatment program. And it's what we call a modified version of the Lindemuth's ADD or Auditory Discrimination and Depth program. The Morris Center and I were modifying it, changing it in ways we thought were going to give us better outcomes, and that's what these studies measured.
I think the real problem that parents end up in is when people use the word research. That is such a broad term, and even with adding the evidence-based or research-based piece of it, at least we're giving a little bit more idea of what type of research it was.
Mm-hmm.
But how many times have you heard somebody say, well, I've done a bunch of research on it, including myself.
Yeah.
But going to Google and searching for stuff and reading a couple articles or reading a couple books and maybe a couple articles falls short from research.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I would like to say that's more gathering information.
It is.
So, when I first started having to read research papers, I had to learn how to read a research paper.
Yeah. It's a different language.
It's a completely different language. And just because you think, oh, I can understand what all these words are, the way it's written is not written for somebody, the layperson, right?
Right.
So, it's very tough for parents to really understand up from down when we're talking about research paper. Because look, every dyslexia program that has been created today has got some claim of having research behind it.
Right.
Whether they are borrowing their research from somebody else's research because they used part of their program and part of another program that had some quasi research to it or whatever, all that the parent is taking at face value is they said they have research behind it.
Right. Right.
So getting parents to the point of being comfortable to ask, at what level is this research?
Yeah. Or what caliber? Is it low
What-
caliber, mid caliber, highest caliber, which is the randomized controlled trials? Yeah. What's the caliber of the research?
Who paid for the research?
Mhm.
Because if it's self-funded
Yeah.
from the publisher of said program,
Right.
there's that. But again, it's about making sure that from a parent's side is that you're as educated as everybody else is in the room.
Mm-hmm.
That way you can ask the correct questions.
Right.
So having that research there, and now, understanding how to read it
Right.
and helping other parents be able to do the same thing. I think that's how we start changing the narrative about what is success and what does it look like.
Exactly. What's the outcome going to be? So reflecting back and saying, okay, so we did all these randomized controlled trials, and we'll come back in a minute and we'll actually talk through their data. But I want to give you the big picture first is after you did all those randomized controlled trials, the next slide showed that we went on and did more. We didn't just stop there. Actually, in 1998, I published a paper on one person, one man who had had a stroke. And the stroke had damaged the left side of his brain. And this is where most of the literacy skills are for most people. And he lost a large amount of his reading skills. And our question was, could we use that modified version of the auditory discrimination in depth program that the Moore Center and I were building? Could we use that with this person who has lost the skills due to brain damage? And so we published this study. And the reason why you publish studies is it's not just some paper we wrote up with our opinions. When you get a study like this published in a research journal, it means usually at least 3 professionals with expertise in this field of dealing with reading problems after brain damage or stroke, reviewed your paper, reviewed your findings, reviewed your data, and made sure that what you were writing didn't overstate the data you had, made sure that you didn't misinterpret your data, made sure that you had adequate statistics and scientific design to remove any bias from the data, and make sure it was just a really solid, accurate scientific presentation of the data. And so this is a peer-reviewed paper showing that, yeah, we took this gentleman's literacy skills, his reading skills, his reading fluency skills, his reading comprehension skills, and we made about 1 to 2 standard deviations. That's going to be like 2 to 4 grade levels of gain in those skills and about 101 hours of instruction. And I didn't stop there. That started a whole new course of research that I was doing. And the next slide shows that we did another paper with my colleague, Dr. Diane Kendall, with some other folks who had also had brain damage that caused their reading papers. And there's 2 case studies there. Next slide shows we published another paper on the brain activity of that first gentleman from the 1998 study and showing how before the treatment, his right side was doing more of the work and the left side wasn't because it was missing most of the parts of the brain tissue. And he's also missing parts of the brain tissue up here, which part of what controls the mouth to move and get it out. And after the brain training that we did with him in that modified version of the Lindemutz program, we saw new activity on the right side and more refined activity on the right side. And we saw his test scores go up. So we even looked at the actual brain activity changes. And the other studies, like one out of Houston, showed the same thing with children with dyslexia. Before treatment, dyslexic kids show more activity on the right side, and they don't score well on reading tests. after this developmental intervention, like what we built with the Now Programs company, you see new activity on the left side that correlates with increased reading skills, increased phonological processing, and you see less activity on the right side. And so some people have misunderstood the imaging data to think that it means that a dyslexic person's brain is hardwired differently. Let me give you a different interpretation of why before treatment the dyslexics have more activity on the right and less activity on the left. If you haven't built fully automatic and fully functional and grade or IQ level literacy skills, like your phonological awareness is not very strong, your ability to sound out words is not very strong, that tells us that wiring is not there that supports those skills. So, of course, we should see wiring someplace else or activity someplace else because you're trying to do it, but you haven't had the right instruction to change this system on the left side to do what most people could do who don't have dyslexia. So it's not that the brain's hardwired differently, it's that the brain is wired by experience and practice. If you don't have the right experience and the right practice, you don't build the correct wiring to build those philological skills. So we didn't stop there. We go on to the next slide that says, here's another study we did with more people who had aphasia, which are the reading problems called phonological alexia. And this is a more current paper we did, and I think it's about 2014. There's another 2016, 2018. So the next slide, it also shows there's our outcome data. Okay, let's go back to that prevention study to say what was the outcome data for the high-risk 5-year-olds. We screened 1,500 5-year-olds. We pulled out 160 kids from the bottom 12% on pre-literacy skills. And what this slide shows you is we split those 160 kids. We pulled 160 kids out of the 1,500 because they were in the bottom 12%. They were most likely to become dyslexic. We knew how to pick that out at age 4 and 5 because our colleagues at Florida State had done a prior study finding what are the best predictors of dyslexia. And believe it or not, it's one very simple task. It's called phoneme elision, or a wordplay task, where you say a word and you ask the child to change it. You say cat, you ask the child to say cat, and then you tell them say cat, don't say k. And a child who's not going to struggle to read and spell can almost immediately say at. So we measured these kids, we split them into 4 groups, and what you see here is that very first bar on the left says, if we gave those 5-year-olds that Now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling program that we built with the nowprograms.com company, 91% of those kids are going to be passing kindergarten and first grade. If you did explicit, systematic, structured phonics, all those popular words that go with the phonics programs of today, keep in mind there's one very big difference theoretically between that first column and the second one. The first column is going from the speech processing system, the ability to perceive sounds and judge sounds and hold down the sounds, and then it's going up to letters later on, and then up even higher to the more difficult sounding outward skills. That second group, explicit phonics, is the reverse. It's called a print to speech program. It's going from letters and figuring out what does PH say, what does AI say, what does AE say, what does KN say, and you're going from letters down to the speech processing, down to the sounds the letters are supposed to represent. It's actually a developmentally reverse of what the brain typically does when you have strong reading skills. The third bar is what if you give kids just extra one-on-one time doing whatever method the classroom is doing. And the fourth bar, the no treatment control, is what happens when you give these kids no intervention. And the reason why the 91% has an asterisk next to it is that was the only group that had independently high effect in preventing them from falling behind and making sure they went to grade 1, grade 2, and they kept progressing after kindergarten. The other 3 bars do not have that asterisk because that means that on any given day, give these kids any 3 of those treatments, you're going to get the same outcome. Only 75, 70, or 59% of them are going to pass kindergarten and first grade. The rest of them are going to be retained. Questions, thoughts about that so far, Stephen? I know it's a lot of data, a lot of talking on my part.
Yeah, I mean, so again, talking from looking at it from the parent side, you want to ask, okay, well, no treatment at all. Well, obviously that's our kids that just learn to read. and don't have any struggles. Extra classroom support. Well, that's right after our tier one instruction. We already all know that tier one instruction is lacking also. Just the basics fundamentals of teaching reading. And then explicit phonics, which is very interesting that explicit phonics is a higher percentage there, because when I was looking at the Texas prison study that UTMB did, well, you can look at the years, how old the prisoner was, and kind of deduce when phonics was being still taught in school. And you can see the numbers of people that were considered dyslexic, and the age group difference or grades or areas were changed. The people that were down here in the phonics area, there was less of them than there were up here when we went to whole word.
Right.
So then you're going, okay, well, is it and this is the big argument in school today. Well, I just add a phonics piece to it and everything should be good, right?
Right.
So what I want our parents to see is now we're teasing out what is missing, what pieces are missing in our reading instruction from the very beginning, whether we're talking tier one or gen ed, your just basic classroom instruction, to high level, high researched intervention for reading. So we're looking at how that really should have been built out. So,
gotcha. So I hope that adds more to help folks understand what we're talking about and why. Now, this is just looking at who got promoted. When you did this intervention that we call Now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling, and it's named that way because that's the developmental hierarchy. You speak early on, you begin to learn words meaning early on, but you perceive sounds before you actually begin to build meaning knowledge of words. And then you go to reading, and last you go to spelling. Spelling's exponentially harder for the brain to do than reading is. And all of them need instruction. Some people make this kind of silly statement that say, well, reading requires direct instruction. Well, the same is true for speaking. If you put a child in a room and let them grow up with nobody talking to him, the child will never talk. So speech requires instruction too, because the brain only builds skills from proper intensity, frequency, and explicitness of training. It's what we call experience-dependent neuroplasticity. That means the brain's going to build language skills when you give the child lots of exposure to language. But sometimes there's a difference in what exposure, meaning what practice builds the best skills most quickly. So not only did we measure in that first study, where again, we screened 1,500 5-year-olds. We pulled out the most high-risk bottom, 12 to 15% of these kids, split them into 4 groups of 40 kids per group, and then conducted this intervention study. We then looked to see, okay, because the most kids made the most gain from the Now Foundations program, which is the developmental speech processing first, print later program. We then looked to see, okay, what did that mean about their reading accuracy scores and reading fluency scores when they're at the end of 2nd grade? And that's what the next slide shows. This shows these kids this is the pilot study data. Sorry, I got these slides out of order. This was the study of what the data we did before. Let me come back to that and we'll skip this one and go on to, here's what happened when the kids were at grade 2. At grade 2, their reading skills were solidly above average in the classroom. They're above the 30th percentile. That's their reading rate. But ironically, and you can see the gold bar is above the green bar, that's because their accuracy was stronger than their speed. And that should make perfect sense to people. You can't do something quick if you don't know how to do it. It'd be like saying you can't teach a kid how to ride a bike and then go put them in a bike race with kids who've been practicing bike riding for years, let alone put an adult on a bike and then put them in the Tour de France. All those other people who are in that field have had a lot more experience, a lot more practice. So this study showed we not only changed how many kids got promoted to grade 1 and 2, but we also brought more than 91% of these kids passed to grades 1 and 2, and on average, their reading rate and reading accuracy were on grade level. But again, the question was, yeah, but what happened when you stopped the instruction? We didn't give them any more instruction after grade 2. They went on to regular classes, regular teacher curriculums, whatever, literacy curriculum the school was using. But now, since they had the core foundational skills, and that's why we named it Now Foundations, for speech, language, reading, and spelling. These kids and these bars they show at grade 4, we brought all these kids back and retested their reading accuracy and reading rate. And that upward slope of the gold line and the upward slope of the green line shows they're now even stronger. Their accuracy is getting stronger and their fluency.
I wanted to add in here, remember the 30th percentile, that's grade level.
Yeah.
And these kids, where the first dot is on the left, the first yellow and green dot, that is not where they started. That is after intervention.
Right.
Where they started, they were down below the 15th percentile.
Yeah, on those pre-literacy skills, because there were 5, they hadn't even had reading instruction yet. We couldn't give them reading tests because they actually had not even participated in reading instruction. But we knew how to predict who had the better phonological skills, the better rapid naming skills that put them at the best chance of making the best progress. And we took the kids with the biggest impairments, the most likelihood not to benefit from the classroom's reading instruction.
So that was the study where you did 80 hours, correct?
No, this one was the kids got 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week for 2.5 years. So it's a small dosage, but long duration. And let me clarify that too. Twice a week, it was with the trained teachers that I was training in that, what we call today, the Now Foundations program. Back then at this study, we weren't selling a program. We didn't have a brand. We didn't have a company. So we said, look, we've modified the Lindenwood's program, that auditory discrimination in depth they first published in 1969. And we've been training them how to implement this with kids one-on-one, 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week. But twice a week was with the trained teacher. Twice a week, we had aides who were trained on how to do reinforcing activities. So they weren't even getting instruction every day. They essentially were getting instruction 2 days a week and a little targeted practice 2 days a week. And then we stopped the instruction at the end of grade 2. It wasn't a model that could actually be implemented in a school. It was a model to say, does it even make a difference? Because the question of that day was, can you even change the trajectory of somebody who comes to school in the bottom 10 or 12%? And this study is one of the first studies in the nation to say, absolutely, and not just by a small amount. Because in the heading of this slide, you see it says 91 to 97% read on grade level. Let me explain that. In this study, all of the kids are impaired, every single one of them. All of them are the severe ranges. So when you have a randomized controlled trial, you can do some statistical analyses of the data and predict what might have happened if we gave this Now Foundations program to a whole classroom of kids. And they're not all going to be at below the 15th percentile on those early phonological literacy skills. And that's where the 97% came from. In that study, published in 2001 and an early piece of it in 1997, it states, if we put this program into a public school setting and gave it to the whole class, we were actually simultaneously doing prevention and enrichment, and we'd have over 97% of kids will be accurately decoding and be fluent readers with that one intervention program systematically delivered with high fidelity.
So I'll add in, I want you to remember back at the NAEP score slide that we showed at the very beginning. This answers that question when I said you got to look at how we're looking at this data. Either that flat line in reading scores is just what it is, and nobody's going to either get above or below it. It's just going to be that.
Right.
Or is it the way we're teaching it? Are we missing things? That's how we start answering these questions.
Right. And tease it apart. So if we look back again at that cover page from that 1991 Annals of Dyslexia paper, that was our pilot study paper. We first just reported on, I think it was about 10 kids who came to the Morris Center, a transdisciplinary team medical clinic geared to help children with developmental difficulties in language, literacy, and whatnot. And that's the theory paper. And then there's the one a little bit further on. Keep going. And there it is. Look, back one. That's the 1991 paper, Annals of Dyslexia, was our pilot study. And so now let's jump ahead to that slide that we skipped when we got into talking about the prevention study that had those green and gold bars and the two bar graphs side by side, and say, okay, here's the data that we saw for those 10 kids. Their sight word skills went from down around the 10th percentile up to almost the 30th percentile. Their ability to decode and sound out words also went from like about the 10th, 15th percentile all the way up to about the 45th percentile. And that's why we got funded to do the randomized controlled trials, because this sample of kids was just a random sample in the clinic. These outcomes didn't prove anything. And that's why if a publisher goes out and gives their program to a classroom of kids and then they write a white paper on it that's actually not in a research journal, it means nobody verified that what they did was correct. Nobody verified that the analyses are the correct type of analyses. Nobody verified that there wasn't any bias in how they wrote things up. It's just a piece of marketing material. And there's no guarantee from that study of just giving their program to one classroom that any other classroom would get the same results. So that's why we did the randomized controlled trials. They're guarantee that the outcomes in that study for those prevention means if we did that intervention in any classroom anywhere in the US for 5-year-olds below the 15th percentile, these are the most likely outcomes. 91% passed kindergarten and first grade. 97.6% of them could be reading accurately and fluently in the actual kindergarten, first grade classrooms. But let's jump ahead to the next study. And there's two more slides. Well, sorry, there's the one that says, we could have almost full literacy. If you have 97.6% of kids reading accurately, this is a quote from a study where it says the treatment was only relatively ineffective, didn't work in normalizing the phonetic reading skills for approximately 2.4% of the children from that total population of our sample. So that tells us we could have 97.6% of kids reading on grade level if we practice an evidence-based approach for tier 1 early instruction. The next study we did that we looked at the cover page was, okay, these are 8 to 10-year-olds. These kids are already diagnosed. They're severely impaired. They're way behind because their reading skills, and that's what this slide shows, their decoding skills, is in the bottom 5th percentile. They are not good at sounding out words, and they're 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. And they're already in special ed. And they're already getting some specialized instruction with programs that are made up or philosophies that are believed or ideas that the teacher thinks might be worth trying. And the data from the school showed us that these skills hadn't changed in about 60 months. But this slide shows this steep jump way up to the 45th percentile when we gave them high intensity, Now Foundations program methodology with high fidelity, and we gave it to them 2 sessions a day, 5 days a week for up to 80 hours. But the average kid only got about 67.5, and there's 30 kids in this group, and that's enough kids to predict that those outcomes will be easily replicated elsewhere. But again, it stops up there at the 45th percentile, and then 1 year later, we brought them back, and the decoding skills dropped a little bit, but it's still on grade level. And 2 years later, you see the skills starting to creep up a little bit stronger. And the bottom of that slide has a very, very profound statement that nobody predicted was going to happen. 40% of these kids staffed out of special ed. Well, why? I mean, because some parents are like, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't want my kid. I fought so hard to get that IEP and get him in special ed. But 95% of children who get into special ed, this is a stat quoted by Barbara Foreman, 95% of children who get into special ed typically never leave special ed. And this says that, hey, we exited not 5%, we exited 40% of kids, an 8 times better outcome if we gave them this Now Foundations program instruction. And 1 and 2 years later, the skills are still strong and growing. This is what we call a dosage study, Stephen, because they didn't get to finish the program. They got a dose of it. And so trying to get this into the schools, as Michelle's asking, that's a great question. And yeah, we've done it in different ways. We partner with schools and we push in services to the schools. They contract with the nowprograms.com company. We built charter schools. We have charter schools that show that we can actually put it into effectiveness there as well. We're building apps. Lip Letterland is a new app that's available online. It's still free for about another 6 weeks or so. You can get it for free, give it a trial. It is the early literacy app that will help build those skills for kids, and the Lip Letterland website tells you more about it. And so one more slide over, Stephen, and this is the final piece of data from this remediation study. This is, what's the purpose of reading? Well, it's to read and understand. And this piece of data on these kids showed that after 16 months of special ed, random ideas, random guessing what to try, random programs being used, typically programs that are not proven by randomized controlled trials, that they made no progress in 16 months of special ed. So you can see why most kids never leave special ed. They're not getting any better. The gap is not closing. And the IEP team, with all their genuine earnestness to try to figure this out, is saying, well, let's try this. Okay, let's try this. Let's try that. But this is a different approach. This is the science approach. We don't need to guess. We need to use what we do in healthcare, which is use things that have been tested and proven to be highly effective by randomized controlled trials. That's what Dr. Sally Shaywitz and the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity advocate for, and that's what we advocate for. These kids went up to the 30th percentile on grade level in reading comprehension, and 1 year later, the gains are stronger. 2 years later, the gains are even stronger, and we're not doing any more instruction. And again, 40% left special ed, they've gone on to regular ed, and they're really now able to read to learn, whereas before they actually couldn't even read. Stephen, your thoughts about that remediation study with the severely dyslexic 8 to 10-year-olds, which was our second randomized controlled trial for proving the effectiveness of the Now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling program?
I would like to first jump back to Michelle's question.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get the schools to want to do this? When I've talked to parents, I try to get them to remember who owns the school districts. Each of us. We're each taxpayers.
Right.
We own the school districts. They're not just an entity that just sits out there and should be, let me say it this way. They shouldn't have just all the control in the world and never have to answer to those of us who are paying the bills.
Mm-hmm.
We are an important part of this whole process. Not only are they educating our kids, we're paying for it.
Yeah.
So you want to know, how do you get your school to do these type of things? Well, we're in the middle of voting season right now. Vote. Make sure that you show up at school board meetings and address your school boards. But the biggest piece of it is make them show you receipts. Make them show you that the curricula that they are purchasing has been vetted at the highest level. They have the most research behind it. Because I can tell you, look, I've never worked in a district. I don't claim to have that knowledge. But from all of the teachers that I know that have been in teaching for 20 plus years, they all say the same thing, which is, if you wait around enough, they'll regurgitate and rename whatever the lesson plan is.
Mm-hmm.
They'll give it some other fancy name,
Right.
put it in a nice shiny box and sell it back to the school.
Yeah.
And then all they've done is taken the lesson plan, blended it up, and sent it back out. And our kids are making the same progress. So again, the way to do this, vote, be very involved in what's going on in your local school, hold your school board and your superintendents accountable.
And I add to that, say accountable for actually purchasing evidence-based programs from randomized controlled trials. Don't accept made-up terminology like evidence-aligned. There's a group who uses this terminology called evidence-aligned. There's no such thing as evidence-aligned. That implies that you could take one piece of the study we did and use that one piece, and it'll be effective too. There's no proof of that. We didn't use any one piece of the program. We used all 10 steps of the program. So either the program is evidence-based from randomized controlled trials or it's not. When it's not evidence-based, it's evidence-aligned, or it's research-based, you have no assurance it's actually going to work the way you want it to work, or that you're going to achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. So
think about
what?
Think about it like this. Dr. Conway or myself hands out all the ingredients to bake a cake.
Mm-hmm.
Lay it out here, and I say, hey, Michelle, I want you to bake me a cake, but I don't give you any instructions on how to, or in directions on how to do it. Nothing.
No
There's
recipe.
the ingredients.
Yeah, no recipe. Here's the ingredients.
No recipe, no nothing. Here's the ingredients. Make me a cake. Well, if Michelle here has ever been in the kitchen and knows how to bake, well, she could probably get her way through it, right?
Yeah.
But for those of us that have, or those of you, I can bake, I can cook. Those of you who have never really spent time in the kitchen, you're not going to know where to even start, right? You're not going to know, what do I put in first? How long do I turn the oven on? How do I tell if it's done or not? Any of those things. When do I mix what in and what measurements? That is the same thing that our districts are doing when they make up these programs. When you hear evidence align, that type of thing, they're going and yes, they're looking at valid research, some of it. They're saying, oh, yeah, well, I've got that piece and I have that piece and I do this and I do that, but they don't know how much of said piece do you do, and they don't know for how long of said piece that you do it. And do you do it before, after you mix it in? Where does that go in, right? So let's make sure that we're following the directions on how to bake this cake properly. The work has been done. The research has been done. We just have to follow it along. We have to follow along with the instructions or the directions.
100%. And we've got April's question there, Stephen. And before we tackle that, when we throw one more piece of slide up, and when we look at this one, this is what happens when we put the data or we put the program in a free charter school. So this is an example of a child in a charter school that's not getting one-on-one instruction like the other studies we talked about, is not getting 2 years of instruction like the other studies we talked about. This is now we've put the Now Foundations program, into this Einstein school in Gainesville, Florida. And they're getting large group instructions. And it really should be called small, because usually it's more like more than 4 kids in the group. It's more like 6 kids in the group. And this child came in scoring below the 10th percentile in all skills. Sounding out words or word attack. Phonological awareness is below the 10th percentile. Reading comprehension below the 10th percentile. Sight word skills below the 10th percentile. And over a period of time, and the bar down below doesn't equate to years or months. It just means we kept reassessing this kid over the time that he was at the school. This kid raised his skills up to the 40th to 45th percentile. Many of these kids will leave the Einstein school where they're doing large group instruction because they're using an evidence-based program from randomized controlled trials. So let you tackle April's question, then I'll come back and we'll wrap up with this. Let me recap the timeline of how we went from modifying the Limits program to joining the Morris Center and doing more research on our modified instruction, to deciding in 2013 to build the Now company and make a program commercially available rather than just keeping it in these small medical clinics, and where we are today with what we're doing.
So my good friend April and I have had this discussion many times. And for those of you that don't know, I live in Texas, and we like to do things differently here in Texas, especially when it comes to dyslexia remediation. I've never understood why, yes, we want to allow people to do their own research, their own districts to do their own research, make sure that they are providing the highest level of education for their children. But I never understood why we don't line all of these dyslexia programs up, because all of them make claims across the board. I mean, just
Everyone says it works. My program works.
everybody says it works, and some are so far fetched that you're just like, I don't even want to talk to you, because now that you've cured my dyslexia, I can tie my shoes better and whatever. But what I would like to see, since this is our taxpayer dollars, I would like to see a research study that says, I'm going to take, program A, B, C, D, and line them up.
Yeah.
And we do a head-to-head comparison.
Yeah.
And look at outcome.
Mm-hmm.
What changed and which approach is the true best way of doing this?
Most effective.
And again, we're going to have a bunch of people say, well, we're all different. No, you can't be just one way to teach you. We all learn differently. And I let me be the first to say, I used to think this. I used to think that I learned differently because of my struggles in school.
Mm-hmm.
However, you challenged me one day when we were talking. You were like, well, explain to me how you learn differently.
Yeah.
Like, well, I don't necessarily have to read the entire book. I can listen to what you're saying, or I can easily deduce what the answer could or should be, just by context clues.
Right.
However, what I didn't realize is that was just a skill that I was honing.
Yeah.
Because I had a deficit, which was I wasn't able to read.
Yeah.
And then you go, well, so you're telling me that somebody that's not dyslexic couldn't learn that same skill?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is no. I was forced to learn that skill where they're not. A non-dyslexic may not be forced to learn that skill and may not be forced to hone that skill to the same level. So I really want people to think about it that way, versus we dyslexics are born with these special capabilities, and because we can't read. And then that goes right back into, because our wiring wasn't efficient, because our wiring wasn't, in some cases in our brain for language, wasn't actually made the right connections. It just makes perfect biological sense that if you have all the parts, meaning the brain matter is there, well, then why are we teaching these kids that haven't had that connection? What I like to consider, some of these programs are teaching language on a college level.
Right.
And these kids can barely sound the sound out and tell you that that's an A.
Yeah.
And you're teaching at a college level language class.
Mm-hmm.
We need to bring this way back down to the beginning levels of language, which is what these studies have all shown.
Right. You can use science to help us understand how to most effectively empower the majority of students to effective language and literacy skills. So let me wrap up by recapping the timeline of how we ended up with the Now Programs company. Its real name is Neurodevelopment of Words, but we've shortened it to Now Programs for simplicity. But initially, back in 1989, I joined the Morris Center. We began modifying the Lindenmuth's Auditory Discrimination and Depth program. That was published in 1969. So here we are 20 years later in 89, modifying it and tweaking it with a group of healthcare professionals: speech pathology, OT, neuropsychology, developmental behavioral pediatrics. We then began using that modified program, and we published a study in 1991 to show, hey, we're getting really strong results. 3 to 5 grade levels gain in children who are significantly severely dyslexic. Then we published 3 5-year randomized controlled trials in 1997, 98, 99, 2001, showing that when this program is systematically provided with high fidelity, it closes the gap for kids who are severely impaired. It prevents reading problems for kids who are at risk, It actually enriches those for kids who are not at risk. And we even show data showing that we can actually rebuild reading skills after brain damage for a reading deficit that's about 1,000 times more complicated than dyslexia, called phonological alexia. It looks just like dyslexia, but it's due to brain damage. And then in 2013, I made the choice to take that program and make it commercially available. So then instead of just saying, hey, the Morris Center uses a branded or modified version of the Lindemutz program, we then built a company, renamed it, and made our version of that program that we had tested, because we're the ones that published all the randomized controlled trials with the Lindemutz program. Some people say, well, LIPS has been studied. Like, well, LIPS doesn't exist in any of those studies. In fact, when we started those studies, LIPS was not even a product. It wasn't even at the market yet. That came out in 1998. But we took the Lindemutz original program, modified it, studied it, tweaked it, perfected it, and then in 2013, we opened the Neurodevelopment of Words, or Now Programs Company, and we branded the name of the program to show we have a very explicit, systematic program that we're being offered, and here's all the research we've done up to this point. Up to this point of 2013, we weren't planning to actually ever make this commercially available. We were not a company trying to sell anything. We weren't doing any marketing about it. We were only doing research studies, speaking at professional research conferences, and trying to advance the science of figuring out how to help advance interventions for children, teens, and adults with dyslexia. So since 2013, we've been building out other ways to make the program more available. And we've got it available now online for as low as $30 an hour in small groups. We have it online, high fidelity, high intensity at $50 an hour in 2 students to 1 instructor. We have it online one-on-one for any age group, whether you're 6 or 66, your brain has to build the same order and foundation of skills, and it's available for $85 an hour. It's some of the lowest price points in the nation for one of the programs that has some of the most scientific proof of effectiveness. And if that wasn't enough, we now have started building apps. And our Lip Letterland, if you go to lipletterland.com or you go to the Apple Store and search Lip Letterland, in about 6 weeks, you'll be able to go to the Google Store and search it as well. But in about 6 weeks, it's going to be for sale at a price. Right now, it's free to download and trial. So lipletterland.com or Lip Letterland, the app, is designed for 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, because we first would actually prevent kids from falling behind. We're going to come back with more versions that actually help support more remediation with high fidelity mobile device delivery. Steve and I left anything out that we've been doing in these last decade plus, or last 11 years of that nowprograms.com company?
I think you covered it all.
All right. Well, I did add a link to the social media platforms that say we have a YouTube channel. You can rewatch this podcast on that YouTube channel. It's Now Programs Online. And it has other videos of client testimonials. It has our other podcast there of dyslexia success stories. We have a large volume of information, research data to back it up. And we do free consultations. If you have questions about your child, teenager, or if you're 55 and you still can't spell and you wonder, is it too late? The answer is no. And if you go to nowprograms.com and click on free consultation, my staff will spend time explaining to you what we can do, why we're going to do it, how it's going to work. And then they're going to ask you one really important question. You want to talk to somebody who's already done this. They'll put you in touch with other 55-year-olds or 45-year-olds who've already gone online and empowered their skills. They'll put you in touch with other parents of kids who are 8, 10, 12, 15 years old who already are dyslexia success stories. Our goal for these companies is one goal. It's empowering global literacy. And Stephen, I can't thank you enough for spending the time with me on the podcast today, our dyslexia discussion, and helping bring down to the general person's level and expand it out to the advocate level as well, so that this message can be more meaningful to more people.
My
Any
pleasure.
last thoughts?
My pleasure.
All right.
I would just, again, I like to tell people, if you suspect that your child has any learning disabilities or possibly could, you know that it's been in your family, things aren't clicking as Dr. Conway loves to hear people say. If things aren't clicking or they're not meeting those milestones, I want us to change the thought process of, oh, that's cute.
Yeah.
Little Johnny wants some biscotti, or they're Pacifically clear. We need to make sure that we're seeing those as signs of a deficit that's an underlying deficit.
Yeah.
The skills aren't there, and they won't develop once they get there to start learning how to read. So please make sure that if you suspect anything, that you're going to your school, if need be, and or to a professional, get some professional testing,
Mm-hmm.
and then start asking lots of questions.
You bet. And ask for the research. Ask for the research. Ask for the research. Hey, Stephen, thanks so much for being a part of this. To our viewers, join next Friday at noon for another dyslexia success story, where we highlight someone who we've actually treated 5, 10, 20. We have people we actually have helped 30 years ago who are happy to share with you where are they today and how much more they don't struggle with literacy. And Stephen, you're one of those success stories. And how many years has it been for you, Stephen? I've lost track.
5 years.
5 years. 5 years ago, we empowered Stephen's dyslexia, and he's been growing great guns ever since. So don't settle for less. We can close the gaps in reading, close the gaps in spelling, close the gaps in comprehension. There's 4 Now programs. Go to nowprograms.com and learn more about what we can do to help empower you. You and your child cannot afford not to partner with us. We have lots of ways to make this affordable, accessible, and we're here to do that. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great Friday evening and a great weekend. We'll see you soon.
Take care.